Salve, discipuli. Okay, today we move on to a quick history lesson on the next poet we're going to read about, or the next poet whose work we're going to read. Here's a picture, or a painting of that poet. This guy is called Ovid. You've probably heard me mention him before. You maybe remember the context in which I mentioned him had something to do with Augustus. Does anybody remember? You'll find out soon enough if you don't remember. So there's a very famous image of him with a book and with a laurel leaf crown. So this poet, his full name is Publius Ovidius Naso. And obviously we get our form Ovid from his nomen. His agnomen Naso, we may have talked about this before, may make reference to a nose, and perhaps there was someone in his family who had a rather large nose, and thus he earned this agnomen Naso. In typical Roman fashion, a lot of times, the cognomen Naso. In typical Roman fashion, sometimes the cognomens are mocking. Ovid is considered to be the last great Augustan poet. This means he wrote during Augustus's reign. Remember Catullus, the poet we just read, wrote during Julius Caesar's time. Ovid is writing during Octavian or Augustus's reign, so obviously Ovid comes after Catullus by quite a bit. Ovid lived from 43 BC to about 17 or 18 AD. We're not 100% sure which year he died in. But obviously, if he was born in 43 BC, he just missed the assassination of Caesar and things like that. Ovid is a love elegist like Catullus. So he's going to write love poetry. His two most famous works in that area are the Amores, which just means the loves, and the Ars Amatoria, which is essentially the art of loving. Another way to describe this work, Ars Amatoria, is sort of a manual on how to pick up women. His other big work is actually mythological and is called the Metamorphoses, and this includes a lot of stories, a lot of myths about people who change into animals or things. Hence the Metamorphoses, the changing of form. Those are his three most famous works. To give you an idea of what he's like as an author, his poetry tends to celebrate sensualism and promiscuity. This is different from Catullus to some degree, right? There's no doubt that Catullus, to some extent, celebrated sensualism, but we've also seen in Catullus's poetry that he's really not promoting any kind of promiscuity. He talks a lot about being loyal to his one woman, and we've seen how upset he was when his one woman dumped him and was not loyal to him. So you see a shift here. Ovid is much more interested in the pleasure of the senses and less interested in loyalty and things like that than Catullus is. Catullus, of course, is promoting love with one woman. Ovid promotes something different. Despite this, you might think that Ovid then was the kind of guy who would never get married, but in fact, Ovid himself was married 3 different times. So it's not like his poetry necessarily was reflective of his lifestyle preferences. Now, the fact that Ovid's poetry did celebrate promiscuity and did not celebrate or promote marriage in any way may have angered Augustus. Remember that Augustus had passed laws of marriage reform in the hopes of getting the upper classes married and having them produce more children to strengthen the upper class. This was a big deal to Augustus. Let's not forget that he ended up exiling his own daughter evidently because she was very promiscuous. So perhaps Augustus was really upset at Ovid for promoting promiscuity, for not taking marriage seriously in his poetry. We're not 100% sure. But what we do know is ultimately Augustus ends up exiling Ovid. And this is the reason I mentioned him earlier in the semester. Augustus exiles Ovid to the Black Sea, which essentially means that he's going to be far from Rome and far from all of the culture of Rome that he loved so dearly. Ovid himself, writing from exile, says that the reason he was exiled was a carmen et error. Carmen would mean song or poem, and a lot of people think that maybe it was his Ars Amatoria that I mentioned in the last slide that upset Augustus. But there are quite a few scholars who look at this and say, yeah, there's no way that Augustus was that upset by a poem. The error, or mistake, or indiscretion, we really don't know what this is. There are people who've guessed that maybe Ovid was involved in some palace intrigue or something like that. We're not sure. But evidently, Augustus was so angered that he brought Ovid in for a private meeting, and the result of that private meeting was that Ovid was exiled to the Black Sea. There is some evidence to suggest, like I just mentioned, that maybe the Carmen was the Ars Amatoria. A little bit of evidence to suggest that maybe this poem really upset Augustus is the fact that this poem evidently was banished from 3 of the libraries in Rome. But again, most scholars now think that the poem really wasn't what made the difference. Once in exile, Ovid stops writing love poetry and starts writing poetry of lament and misery. He writes some really sad, depressing stuff to reflect his mood. It is very clear that he was miserable in exile, very clear that he really missed Rome and was hoping that he might be called back at some point. And it seems that his life had very little joy in it at that point. He never does get called back, and ultimately Ovid ends up dying in exile. Kind of sad. I want to talk just a little bit more about what Ovid does with his poetry, in particular the love elegy that we're going to read. Ovid should be seen as the guy that kind of bucks the tradition. Think about Catullus as a member of the Novi Poetae. Think about how Catullus was railing or responding to the tradition of guys like Cicero and all of that. Ovid's going to come along and see a tradition established by Catullus, and Ovid is going to buck that tradition. Okay? A classic example of how he does this is Ovid, when he does write about one woman, which is not all the time, but when he does write about one woman, he calls her Corinna. Compare that to Catullus' Lesbia. And Ovid even sets us up so that they scan differently. Okay? So even in the scansion of the name of the girl he's talking about, Ovid is saying, hey, I'm not going to do what all those other love elegists did. I'm going to do something a little bit different. Now that said, Ovid really doesn't just write about this woman Corinna. He writes about a lot of women. Okay? He's very clear in that it's just not worth tying yourself down to one. In his poetry. That's what he says in his poetry. Catullus and some of the other Novi Poetae type guys, they generally would talk about one woman and talk about dedicating themselves to that one woman being faithful to her. All right, Ovid, on the other hand, says, it's kind of more fun if you don't do that. Ovid writes in a humorous way, and Ovid writes in a playful way, in contrast to Catullus, who tends to write about a serious, deep love. You're more likely to laugh at some of the stuff Ovid says. You're more likely to giggle and just think, oh, that's kind of fun. You're not as likely to see all of the sadness and all of the dedication to just one woman that you saw in Catullus. Remember that when Catullus finds out that Lesbia has cheated on him, he's distraught, he's very sad, he writes all these poems to try to get over her. Ovid, on the other hand, I think would just say, ah, well, let's go find another one. Okay, Ovid's much more concerned with humor, playfulness. He's more concerned with sensuality, the joys and the pleasures. Okay, not so much concerned with what happens when it goes wrong. And we're going to end here with just a couple of quotations from Ovid. And your assignment will be to see if you can figure these out. I'll give you a lot of help. The first one, this first quotation from Ovid is pretty clearly from his exile, because he starts with two commands, perfer, which basically means endure, and obdura, which is something you saw recently in Catullus. He used this word at least twice, so you guys should be able to figure that out. So endure and something else. Proterit is the only thing I'm going to help you with in this next part. Proterit means will be a benefit. Okay, so endure and something, and then this word means will be a benefit. Let's see if you guys can figure out the quotation, and I'll ask you about it in class the next day. Then we have one last quotation from Ovid. Again, I'll give you just a little bit of help, and then you figure the rest out. The only help I'm going to give you here is the word dulca, which means sweet. Dulcus, dulca means sweet. And I've underlined it in green because it is going to be your nominative here. So here's another famous quotation from Ovid, kind of a fun, playful one. Your job is going to be to figure out what that means. All right, Discipoli, that's all I have for you. Waleta.